This is more than just a pretty scene and a symbol of our history and heritage. Canadian farmland is an engine for our economy, creating jobs and driving trade. It's our assurance of food security, the source of food on our plates. Farmland is our commitment to maintaining an ecological balance and conserving biodiversity. And it links us all to a shared responsibility to protect it. Do you know that our farmland is facing significant threats that impact all of us? We'll look at the major ones: urbanization, industrialization, and climate change. Canada is one of the fastest growing countries among the G7 nations. Not since Confederation did our population grow so rapidly as it did in 2022. Around 40 million people now live in Canada. But only about 7% of our total land area is agricultural land. Yet Canada is facing pressure to produce more to meet the demands of feeding the nation and export more agri-food products. Farmland is competing with urban sprawl for industry and space. And extreme weather events are putting our food production at risk.
We can't predict with climate change when those extreme events will happen, how long they'll happen for, and what that will do to our ability to farm.
Sarah Epps' research has looked at protecting farmland. How severe is the climate change threat to Canadian farmland?
I think the challenge is we don't know how severe it's going to be. I think there's huge risks that we really aren't fully aware of because we've seen these weird sort of blips where it's terrible one year, it seems to be a little bit more manageable the next year, and we haven't fully realized that consistent challenge that climate change is going to be year after year.
How are extreme weather events impacting Canadian farmland?
So we're seeing it play out in different ways in different parts of the country. It really depends on where you are, whether it's droughts that we're seeing out west fairly consistently, in the prairies in particular, lots of rain that we're seeing in Ontario this season as well, and really just extreme weather events where frosts are happening at times we don't expect them or don't anticipate, don't want them because they're so destructive to many of our crops earlier in the growing season, earlier towards the end of the season than they've been in the past, and really just destructive because we can't predict these things as we have in the past because they are so extreme.
In addition to climate change, industrialization and urbanization are also major threats to Canadian farmland. How are they chipping away at arable land?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we're seeing is something we call the death by 1,000 cuts. And so we see this trend of, we'll just sever a little bit more of the land for houses. We'll sever a little bit more for urbanization. The farm is maybe fallow this year, so maybe we don't need it, and we'll convert that into something else. And the challenge is, once you pave over farmland, it's gone forever. We can't get that land back. And so we see that happening relatively consistently across the country, in Ontario, in British Columbia, in different parts out east, where we have this housing crisis, as we know, and we need more homes. We know that's a reality of our situation. And farmland is relatively easy to develop. It's green space. It hasn't been developed. So it is essentially clearing out whatever was there, paving over it, putting in a subdivision potentially, and then we've lost that farm forever. And so we see that happening across the country. And we don't really, I think, recognize in 30 years we're going to regret a lot of those decisions because we won't ever get that land back.
You mentioned Canada has a housing crisis. We also need farmland. So there's a conflict. Is there a solution, a compromise?
It is absolutely a conflict, but I think we can find a balance. And I think part of that is just better planning policies that protect the farmland and recognize that in Canada, in certain places, we have some of the best soil available in the world. And we're very, very fortunate for that. And so it's about protecting the best soil, recognizing we're going to lose some of it. There's no other way around it, especially if we're in a very urban place within the country. That land will likely be lost. But it's recognizing that with better planning policies, with better, higher intensification, higher density levels, we can build up and not out. And then we're limiting the amount of land that we're losing while also helping to reduce that housing crisis. And so it's really about finding a balance between up, higher densities, and protecting the very best land that we have, because it is a very finite and valuable resource.
Ralph Martin's research has looked at food sustainability and preserving production capacity. In addition to climate change, urbanization, and industrialization, what are other threats to farmland?
I think the other threats are not managing it properly. It's really important that when we manage our soil, that we have cover crops, that we have soil amendments that we add to the soil, that we look after the soil in such a way that we are increasing soil organic matter so that it can be productive regardless of the situations that happen with weather.
Like many things in life, farmland is not created equally. Some land is better suited to farming than others. There are many classes of farmland. Why is it important to protect the highest class of farmland first?
Well, Class 1 agricultural land essentially has no limits for agriculture, whereas Class 7 at the bottom has all kinds of limits, like it's essentially rock. So Class 1 is going to help us maintain productive yields even when there is too much water or too little water. With floods, good Class 1 land allows water to percolate through the soil. When there are droughts, it hangs on to the water and provides it to the crop. And we have some research at the Elora Research Station, and it's been going now for 35, 40 years. And it's really clear that on productive land, on Class 1 land, we have much better results over time than we do in less productive land.
Why is it so important to protect our best farmland first?
Our best farmland is what we call prime agricultural land. And so on that class 1 through 7 scale, it's classes 1, 2, and 3. And essentially what classes 1, 2, and 3 mean is almost anything can be grown on that land. And when you get into the higher classes, it's harder to grow things like tender fruit, grapes as an example, and other crops. So if you recognize that it's this land that can essentially grow anything, and it's often in places where the climate permits that growth of almost anything, it's such a unique situation that is envious of other countries in the world because we have this incredible land, we have the climate in those areas as well that support very diverse crop production. And so if we know that and we're aware of how important that land is, protecting it is really, really critical. And unfortunately, those areas are also at the greatest risk of urbanization. Just the way population settlements grow, you start your settlements where the best land is available for farming purposes, and then as centuries move on, we see that development pressure in those areas.
What are some other benefits to keeping our best farmland at a high level of production?
I might quibble a little bit with necessarily being at high level. Like, I think it's important to have rotations. So I would argue that sometimes it's appropriate to have a forage crop in the rotation, and that crop is not available for people to eat directly. So cattle or sheep might be eating that crop, and that might be 1 year of 4 or 5. But if we include that in the rotation, arguably it takes down the high productivity over the 5 years, but it maintains productivity for a longer period of time. And looking after that Class 1 land is essential as we go into climate change, because it's very clear that as we have too much water or too little water, or the temperatures are too high or too low, that it's the best land that we're going to need to see us through that. So that's the land we have to keep in agriculture.
And if we leave marginal land, for example, available, are there not also benefits to wildlife, parkland?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are lots of benefits with marginal land, classes 3, 4, 5, yes. In cities and urbanization, I would prefer to see densification. And there are all kinds of people that talk about gentle densification, and I think it's really worth it, both for the people who live there. Arguably, they have better lifestyles when there is gentle densification, and we should leave farmland to be farmed as farmland, or some of it is wetland. And we need biodiversity throughout the landscape, and to have biodiversity corridors linking Class 1 land with 2, 3, 4. So I would like to limit urbanization as much as possible on a footprint basis.
Farmers and agricultural scientists are doing their part to keep our farmland healthy. What are some innovative farming practices that are taking place now to preserve farmland?
I think there are some really interesting things happening with weed control. When I started my career, we hadn't heard of robotics. And now there are all kinds of robotic weed control implements that can go through a field and not necessarily use tillage, but they can be so refined that they have fingers that pluck weeds right out of the soil, or they just scratch the surface and pull the weeds out. They can run 24/7. They don't need coffee breaks. They can often be run with electricity, and there might be a solar panel on the farm running them. We haven't seen their potential yet, but I think that's one of the things that is going to make agriculture more sustainable And I think that's going to help preserve farmland. It will make it less necessary to use pesticides, and it will make it less necessary to use tillage.
Another innovative farming practice is agroforestry. Can you tell us what it is and how it works?
There was a research plot out in Victoria Road, and Dr. Andy Gordon was the researcher who did that for 30, 40 years. And they were growing wheat, soybean, corn between rows of trees. Some of them were black walnuts. There were various species of trees. And you get the benefit of the trees growing, holding the soil in place, dropping leaves, so there's nutrient recycling, there's shading. Now, I think with the corn, there was a little bit of a yield cost to the corn because corn loves heat, whereas the soybean and the wheat were actually shaded and they benefited a little bit from the trees. But overall, the productivity of the land increased and nutrient cycling was certainly enhanced with that process.
What are some of the repercussions of losing our farmland?
Yeah, so some of the repercussions, and I think we haven't fully seen this play out yet, but is a food system where we're dependent even more so than we are today on imports. And so we're very fortunate in Canada where we grow so much of our own food. We export a lot of it because we do have surplus. When we erode away that farmland base, we can't grow the foods that we're used to today. We can't raise the livestock that we're used to consuming today. And so we're going to rely even more heavily on imports. And on top of that, food security issues are going to occur because we know food costs are going up. We see that with inflation now happening. It's going to go up even higher, and certain parts of the country are going to experience that threat even more so than others. So northern communities in particular, more remote and rural places will experience the risks of those higher costs and the dependence on imports. And we really erode away our own food security. If we can't provide food within our country, that dependence on imports is really, really risky. And I think we'll see that play out even more with the continued loss of farmland.
What would be the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario we would see is year after year losses in food. And so farmers putting in effort into planting their fields, into raising livestock, and the constant threat of forest fires that we're seeing play out right now across the country impacting what we can do on our farms. Droughts causing severe devastation on many farms and not having any production occurring year after year in those areas. One of the challenges with climate change is there's a sense that northern Ontario and northern parts of the country will benefit from climate change because temperatures will go up. That may be true, but the extreme events we see with climate change mean we don't know that will open up the northern parts of the country for farming purposes because we can't predict with climate change when those extreme events will happen, how long they'll happen for, and what that will do to our ability to farm.
Would you say climate change then is chaos?
Yes, I think chaos is the right word, absolutely, for climate change, because it is really an unknown. We have years where everything seems great and people say climate change doesn't exist. And then the next year we have these extreme events and everyone is surprised and shocked and can't believe that we haven't had rain in an entire summer. And so it really is a chaotic situation that is very difficult to plan for.
Federal and provincial governments are working at the policy level to promote sustainable farming and encourage the protection of farmland.
Federally, we don't see as much happening with the protection of farmland. It really is left to the provinces. And then even below that in municipal politics, we see that play out quite a bit. In British Columbia and Ontario, we have some fairly strong provincial policies that protect farmland. In Ontario, it's the Greenbelt, and in British Columbia, it's the Agricultural Land Reserve. And so that's from a provincial level, which tends to be the strongest in terms of protection. At local levels, we also see local governments creating their own policies that protect farmland, that state, here's where our urban boundary is. We don't want to develop into the farmland that's adjacent to this. And we see those policies of higher density, intensification, building up and not out. And so it really is something that plays out, I think, on the ground at the much more local level.
Does the federal government, through Agriculture Canada, through federal policies or grants, do they have an impact as well?
In terms of planning, not so much, but what we do see at the sort of local farm level is they do provide grants for agro-environmental stewardship practices, for conservation. So we see some of that play out. They also provide funding in terms of economic development. And so if we know a successful farm and a farm that will be around for the future is one that is financially stable and is making money, those grants absolutely help, and it helps to stabilize our farm system and our agri-food system as well.
Some of these policies also end up supporting wildlife and nature conservancy or nature conservation.
So it's really interesting. I think when we think of farmland, we think of these huge hundreds or thousands of acres of land that gets plowed every year, that we have livestock on, and we don't know that there's a whole host of other services that farmland provides. So it provides, as you said, wildlife habitat. It provides filtration for water. There's oftentimes water courses that run through agricultural land, and as well in terms of conservation of woodlots and other sort of natural areas on farms. We do see policies that come through that help maintain the natural elements on farmland and provide financial benefit to farmers to utilize agro-environmental stewardship practices, and recognizing that if we're protecting a part of a farm and saying that, well, this woodlot should stay a woodlot for wildlife, the farmer loses out in a way financially because they're not using that land for farming. So we have grants available and we have other programs in place to help support the farmer to maintain that conservation area. The whole system benefits.
The word farmland preservation and farmland protection are sometimes used interchangeably.
Right.
Is there a difference, and is the difference important?
Well, I think there is a difference, and protection is what I think of politicians and others doing to make sure that we don't use farmland for other purposes. Preservation is making sure that those who farm the land farm it in a way to keep it growing productively, using cover crops, adding soil amendments, and so on.
What is sustainable intensification? Can you explain it to us?
Sustainable intensification is getting more with the same input, or maybe even less of the input. So for example, you can apply nitrogen fertilizer and maybe get 150 bushels per acre of corn with 150 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. If you use it well and there's sustainable intensification, we might get 160, 170, up to 200 bushels, but not increasing the fertilizer. But I want to qualify sustainable intensification. It's not the cat's meow. I mean, it's good, but I think the way the environment experiences nitrogen or other nutrients or pesticides or tillage is the overall effect. So even if we have sustainable intensification and we use nitrogen fertilizer more efficiently on a per acre basis, if we have more acres of corn rather than some of the food crops that we could grow directly on those acres, then the environment is experiencing a negative overall because there are too many acres in corn when we could use some of those acres to grow food crops directly.
Farmland protection and preservation are essential to our ability to grow food for ourselves and for our economy to thrive. How does farmland protection contribute to food security in Canada, our economic stability, and environmental protection?
Climate change is all about temperatures that are too high or too low at the wrong time, or having too much water or too little water at the wrong time. It's really important to protect farmland, especially Class 1 and Class 2 farmland, because those classes are most likely to get us through those times when we have too much water or too little water, or temperatures that are too high or too low.
What are some other benefits to safeguarding our farmland now and in the long term?
Well, we have the benefit of more biodiversity in the landscape, and that's going to be good not only for us, but for other species in the environment overall. It's important to protect farmland because we sometimes think that we can grow food with technology. And yes, technology helps us, but in the end, to have enough calories and nutrients for people to survive appropriately and to do so in right relationship with other species, we are going to need farmland with multiple species and good healthy soil to sustain that.
Other threats to farmland, in addition to, let's say, high cost, and we talked about urbanization, climate change, industrialization. You mentioned one that I hadn't thought of before.
Well, I think it's really important to think about how we're going to keep farming in the future. And many farm families have a number of siblings on the farm. Not all want to farm, but some do. And I think we have to make it quite possible for those young people who want to farm to farm. They come to that farm with knowledge, and some of them might be the 4th, 5th, 6th generation. I had one student who was the 9th generation on his farm in Prince Edward County. So someone who comes to the farm with multiple generations behind him or her is going to think in the long term because they know their ancestors have been there. I even know one farmer whose grandpa wanted to be buried in the orchard, and he said, I think that's so grandpa can watch us and make sure we're not misbehaving. And that type of thing is really important if you're going to think in the long term to preserve farmland and make sure that it's going to provide for future generations and going into 8, 9 generations.
You have to know about it to care about it. That's why community engagement and education are so vital to protecting our farmland.
What we see right now happening in agriculture is a real separation in generations from the farm. The majority of Canadians have no connection directly to farmland, to farming, to agriculture. Decades ago, you knew somebody, your uncle, your grandmother, somebody was on a farm, and we had that connection and recognized that food came from a farm. That disconnect today, and I think some of that comes from an uninformed consumer simply because of that separation from farm, means we aren't as concerned where our food is coming from. And so an informed consumer knowing where their food is grown, that it's grown locally, whether that's in Ontario close to home or it's coming in from British Columbia or out east, also knowing that the different programs that are available to conserve farmland, to conserve the natural habitats that we see happening in some farm ecosystems, that information helps them to support the farmers directly, which will help in turn support the protection of farmland, support our agri-food system, and really just help stabilize our food system that we have here in Canada.
The next time you see a patch of farmland, remember, it's more than just land. It's our food security, economic stability, and a key to protecting the environment. We can do our share by supporting Canadian farmers and taking an interest in agricultural policies so that we make informed decisions today that will impact future generations.